Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sibme Coach Replay Show. This month, we're talking about the roles of coaches, the different roles that we have. And sometimes our coaches aren't just coaches. They're also building leaders. They're the boss. They're the campus or district-wide leader. And so I'm so excited to have Dr. Justin Baeder, Director of the Principal Center, host of the Principal Center radio podcast, author of Now We're Talking, 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership, and host of Ascend Live, a video show on ed leadership. So he's here with us now. Our other co-panelist wasn't able to make it. She's a principal in a school and was called for an emergency principal meeting, as we all know how that goes, especially this year. So we're wishing her well, and we'll hopefully catch up with her another time. But welcome, Justin.
Thank you so much, Corey. Great to be here. And Heather sends her regards, but we certainly understand being a principal means being called into all kinds of things on short notice. So certainly understand.
Yeah, running a building and full of people and children is definitely a big task, again, especially this year. So we're talking today about just the differentiated roles of being an instructional leader and being a coach. And lots of the coaches that I work with are wearing dual hats, right? Multiple hats, where they are the principal in the school or an assistant principal. They are seen as the boss. They have a role in evaluation even, but then they're also trying to formatively support and grow their teachers professionally in addition to that. So tell me, what are some of the roles? And I know you've got 3 that you plan on sharing with us. So what are the 3 roles instructional leaders can play in changing teacher practice?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, there are always multiple hats. It's a little bit different in every school. And certainly, the most common role is that of an administrator, right? I think there are maybe like 2 schools in the world that don't have a principal. You see news stories about them sometimes, but many schools do have instructional coaches, but of course many don't. So I think, I work primarily with principals, and I think that that interplay of different roles is the most real for people who do have those formal admin responsibilities. So the first role that I thought was worth highlighting, because sometimes it does interact with even the role of someone who can just focus on coaching, is that role of a boss, right? Everybody who is an administrator is a boss, a supervisor in some way. And that makes us a little bit uncomfortable to talk about in education, right? Like, we don't really like calling ourselves the boss. We don't really like thinking of ourselves as supervisors. We prefer to think of ourselves as coaches, as, instructional leaders, as transformational leaders. Like, we have all these other words we would much rather use than boss. But the reality is, sometimes what we need to do is on the supervision side. It is on the accountability side, making sure that people follow through on things. And that does interact directly with our instructional leadership work. And I've noticed a difficulty that happens when we try to coach people to compliance, right? If someone is simply out of compliance with something that's basic and essential, right? If you're not taking attendance, if you are not planning your lessons, well, it might be tempting to try to soft pedal that and say, well, I'll just, kind of coach them up. I'll build them up. I want to take a supportive approach. But there are some things where it's absolutely needed for us to take a hard line and to be the boss and to not try to coach people into things that are really simply basic expectations and behaviors. So the boss role is there. If we do need to get someone to change their behavior, we can do that. Do that through that kind of directive feedback. But if you're like me, I think most of us are pretty reluctant to do that, right? Like, we really only want to wear that hat if we absolutely have to. 99% of the time, we don't want to wear that hat, right? Because it's the least pleasant. Nobody likes to see us coming when we've got that boss hat on, and we want to be the coach. We want to wear that coach hat as much as possible. So, and I think this is the one, of course, that overlaps with instructional coaches, instructional facilitators, anybody who's in a non-administrator role but provides support to teachers, department chairs, so the coach
Lead teachers, yeah.
function, lead teachers, anything else you can think of, jump in here, but, it covers so many different positions. That coaching role. I think in the coaching role, what we're trying to change is not the behavior, but we're really trying to improve people's practice by changing their thinking, right? If I look at like, what is the leverage for improving practice with the boss hat, you're really just trying to change their behavior. You're not doing this, you need to do it. With the coach hat, people kind of know what they're supposed to do. They're doing the best they can, and it's the lever that we're trying to pull to bring about improvement. To try to nudge that boulder uphill a bit is really to improve the thinking, right? So that's where we get into things like asking good questions, right? Paying close attention, getting people to reflect on their practice. And I know you have seasons and seasons, many episodes on coaching in particular. But I think for the, for instructional leaders who want to change teacher practice, most of the time we're going to want to be in that coach role because that's where we're all kind of there voluntarily, right? The teacher's there, somewhat on board. They're not being forced to do something. You're there in kind of a collegial capacity. It's not just something that you have to do to hold somebody accountable. So it's just much more pleasant. And hopefully this is where we want to be most of the time. The third role is one that I realized I needed to play when the teacher wasn't necessarily the one who needed to change, right? Like sometimes I would be in a conversation with a teacher about their practice and what they were doing and kind of what the opportunities for improvement were. And sometimes I would realize, you know what, this is actually not something the teacher needs to change. It's something that I need to change as a building manager, as a person who's in charge of the schedule or the budget. I need to change the circumstances under which this person is able to work, because no matter how great a job they do, if the circumstances are what's wrong, then that kind of falls to me. That's my job as a leader. So I call that the leader role. And we say that the type of feedback we're engaging in there is not reflective feedback. It's not directive feedback like you'd give as a boss, but we call it reflexive feedback. The idea that it's a two-way street. I'm giving feedback, but I'm also receiving feedback from teachers in those conversations about what conditions they need to work under if they are going to do their best work. I think the listening there is really key with that leader role.
Yeah, and I love how you have differentiated these three roles, especially for our building and organizational leaders, right? Being able to, because many of them do find themselves in those, three kind of situations or roles with their folks. We've got our people who maybe are voluntold or are being voluntold that, hey, we need to make some changes in your classroom, and that directive feedback then is part of that. Then those who are a little bit more intrinsically driven, they're interested, they want the feedback, we're able to have that collegial conversation and partner with them in the growth of their classroom, and it's that mutually beneficial. And then looking at that kind of broader scope of being the building leader or the organizational leader and thinking about how all of these circumstances, as you mentioned, come together to support that teacher and what they're trying to do, the goals they're trying to attain, the learning they're trying to create in their classroom, and really the culture in your building as well. So I think those are really, really great differentiators. And it is something that's more unique to our administrators, instructional leaders, than it is to our folks who are not in that evaluative stage. They're not the boss, they're the instructional coach, instructional support, team leader, any of those other pieces. So it's really is unique.
Can I ask about that?
Yeah.
What do you think about coaches who get information that might fall under one of those other hats? Because I think that's always a little bit of a challenge, a little bit awkward. As a coach, you find out things that maybe you kind of wish you didn't. You kind of wish that had gone straight to the principal because it's not your area. I don't know. What's been your experience in kind of wrangling that information that you kind of, that's not me.
Right. Yeah. Not my lane. Yes, definitely. Sometimes there are where a teacher has, presented a need that it recalls for that leader. And I am not that leader as the instructional coach. Sometimes it's because I'm the campus-based coach. In other circumstances, I've been the consultant coming in to the organization, providing support to that teacher. And so then it's the conversation on how do we get that support? How do we get that leader to acknowledge that there are some things that are impacting our growth that are more in their lane. So sometimes that's a direct conversation with the leader, but for me, I always try to empower the teacher to go and have those conversations with their administrator. So that way they can, really work together for that, but they're also, we've built that capacity that they're able to reach out for those things. There's so many times as a coach where we are brought into conversations or circumstances that aren't always part of our wheelhouse. Sometimes we are brought into conversations that really do require maybe a counselor or a therapist. And as much as we want to be able to support that person and be there for them, they maybe need another individual to really help them work through some of those more personal pieces or those emotional pieces that they're feeling. So I think knowing your limits is one of the most important things that we can do as a coach, and being able to identify if you are able to wear multiple hats, which is the appropriate one, but then also when that hat is not on my rack over here, and I need to find somebody else who's going to be able to support that teacher in that way. Yeah.
And let me just say to administrators, if you have an instructional coach, wonderful. Pure gold to have an instructional coach in your building. But this is precisely why they should not be the only people who are getting into classrooms, right? If they are the only people who have eyes on the problems that are going on, then they're in this awkward position of having to bring problems to the administration and say, hey, so-and-so is really struggling, you might need to walk by and, see what's going on there. Like, you don't want your coaches to be put in the position of tattling. That is not a good, right? That's not a good position.
Exactly. So. There's, with the cohorts of coaches and leaders that I work with, we talk a lot about what should be on and off the table when it comes to conversations about a teacher's professional growth. And we pull from Pete Holland and Lisa Simmerall's book in Creating a Culture of Reflective Practice. They give some really great kind of guidelines, what their reflective level is, what their goal is on the table, definitely. But when it comes to performance and kind of where they are, that really should be something that the building administrator then goes and sees for themselves, right? Because we can very quickly and easily move into that kind of tattletale feel. I remember when I was doing my internship for instructional leadership, and suddenly my peers saw me different because I was spending more time in the building office, more time next to our building administrators, and it suddenly felt like, well, certainly we have to be careful of what we say or do or ask around Corey because, we don't know exactly what that relationship is. So clarifying how I communicate with campus administrators and, with others who might be in support department chairs and lead teachers of that individual, I think is also important. And then sticking to that for sure. Yeah.
Great point.
So I'd love for us to go to that kind of uncomfortable hat that you first mentioned of being a boss. And directive feedback, I talk a lot with my coaches about, based on the reflective level of a teacher, where directive feedback is kind of most appropriate based on their mental model at that point and how they're seeing and reflecting on their own instruction. But for you, what are your suggestions for the conditions that really are the best in order for directive feedback to actually be helpful for a teacher?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to what we're trying to improve, right? If we're trying to improve someone's thinking, then directive feedback is probably not going to get us there, right? Like, you can't just tell someone, be smarter, make better decisions, like that's kind of like saying, what's wrong with you, right? That's not helpful.
Right.
But if what we're trying to change is, following through on things, if we're trying to change behavior, if someone is dropping the ball or if someone is just ignoring something that they should be attending to.
Right.
Then, like if you have a teacher who's ignoring the IEP modifications that a
Mhm.
student needs, like, hey, you have to read the IEP, you have to work with the SPED teacher to meet this kiddo's needs, then directive feedback can be effective in changing the behavior. And I think one place where we've got to look at the overlap and the relationship between reflective feedback with that coach role and the
Mhm.
directive feedback with the boss role is that sometimes we might discover that people are using reflection to dodge accountability. And I don't know
Mhm.
if you had anybody who kind of fell into this pattern in your work, but sometimes people will enjoy the safety and kind of the out that's provided by a reflective conversation and a coaching relationship, and
Mhm.
part of the softness of a coaching relationship is that you have a little bit of agency to say, no, I don't want to work on that. Or yes, I want, you can shift the focus. You can move the goalposts a little bit
Right.
when
Yeah.
you're being coached. And sometimes people do that in order to avoid confronting things that they're not comfortable with, to avoid doing things that they just don't want to do. And sometimes we have to say, or work with, the other members of our team to come to a solution and say, hey, look, this is something that's got to get done. You
Mhm.
can't just reflect your way out of it. You can't say that you've just decided that doesn't matter. You don't have that, like you have to do this. And
Mhm. Mhm.
again, not fun, right? This is
Right.
not something that anybody enjoys. If this is super fun to you, uh,
Share
then
your ways and how you
yeah,
make
let
that
me know
enjoyable,
if
right?
you love this. But yeah, most of us just do not enjoy that kind of thing because it's awkward,
Mhm.
it's uncomfortable, and
Mhm.
it's not really what drew us to instructional leadership. But yeah, I would say if someone is really dodging, if they're using being coached as a way to avoid being accountable, then
Yeah.
I think that may be where we need to play a different role.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that. And I think if you are the individual who has those multiple hats, right, it's a little bit easier for you to pick that up. Whenever I was working in special education as a coordinator, a big part of my role was coaching, but it was also ensuring compliance. So your IEP example definitely hit home for me. I had many of those conversations where this is not a choice. It's not that these might be supportive. These are the things that we as a team have decided that this student needs legally and educationally in order to be able to grow and access the curriculum. So we need to begin doing this and then following up with, how do we begin taking steps towards that? Sometimes because we haven't been accountable, it seems like such a big leap to begin doing that, or even to begin, if it's an attendance issue, you have to take attendance, you have to submit it by this time. So let's talk about a plan to make that feasible for you, get you in a routine so that way it gets done. And it's not something that you're constantly trying to remember to do, but let's create some automaticity around some of these non-negotiable pieces. When you are a coach and that is your only role, it can be difficult when I, as a consultant coach, sometimes I'm hired to come work with a teacher on a very specific non-negotiable piece of instruction. But then as I'm talking and getting to know that teacher, I see a little bit of that kind of hiding through that reflection. And well, what I really want to work on is this thing over here. I don't feel like I can get to that unless I've had this. And sometimes there's a direct connection. If it's rigor that I was asked to come and work with, but we've got some classroom management issues that the teacher wants to be supported in and support, we definitely have to have classroom management ready and in line in order for rigor to really be able to happen across our classroom. So some of those things they do mesh, but then when they don't, if you are that coach, or if I have a coach in my building who is addressing that, what is the best way you think, Justin, for a coach to maybe reach out to the admin on their team and without being that tattletale, but also to kind of say, hey, I think we have a situation here. What do you think is the best way for a coach to approach that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the very best, this is cheating to answer it this way, but I think the very best is if your administration is in classroom so much that you're not in that position, right? Like that's the
Right.
best case scenario.
Yes. Yeah.
Can't get away from that. But I think if something does come to your attention that
Mhm.
that does need to be on that radar. Like, you don't want to break the trust. You don't want to
Mhm.
violate the, I don't want to say like the sanctity of the coaching relationship, but that,
That's
that
exactly the
trust.
word I was thinking of. So yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, that's so important. I think, in some ways, we try to get to, the administration to just kind of notice on their own, hey, you might want to stop by and you might notice some
Mhm.
things related to blah blah blah. And if the administration is never in classrooms, that's not going to be real, right? That's going to be pretty obvious in that.
Right,
So,
right, right.
again, the more administrators are in classrooms, the easier this gets. I
Mhm.
think, you know, as far as wearing the boss hat as a coach, I think you do have the right to not have your coaching clients jerk you around, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
not follow through, because not following through in the name of reflection, that's just cheating, right? Like, that's not a good way to be a coachee. And I think
Mhm.
it's okay to hold people accountable to that and say, hey, like, I'm going to put a lot of time into supporting you, and I want you to make the choices about how you're going to change your practice. But at the same time, after you've made a choice, I do expect you to follow through. Like, you have obligations to me, even though you're driving the bus here. This is your practice that we're striving to improve. But I do expect that you are following through. So on the follow through side, that's,
Mhm.
I think, a reasonable thing to ask. It is tough if there is something of, more concern that you feel like you kind of do need to tattle. You kind of do
Right.
need to, it's unethical to know certain things and not say anything.
Mhm.
So, there are different things that come into play depending on what it is, right? Like, obviously, if someone is harming students, the coaching relationship is not the priority there. Like, you
Exactly.
got to let
Right.
that go and say, look, I'm a mandatory reporter. You can't, do anything illegal, or I am absolutely going to tell on you. We all are.
Mhm.
And that's a norm that we have to reinforce in our profession, that, we're colleagues, we've got each other's backs, but not for crimes, right? You are,
Right.
there are, there
Exactly.
are, there are pretty bright lines there.
Mhm.
When it comes to things that are, a little bit more gray areas or judgment calls, or, things that people are just struggling with, um, I think one thing that we can do is we can describe the ethical dilemma that we're in as a coach and say, hey, this is something that, is not really my area, but it's something that's come to my attention, and I would like your input on the best way to handle that. I can't let it go. I do need to make sure that this is being addressed, that, that the appropriate people are involved in this, but I'm
Mhm.
not one of those people. So what would you like me to do? I think it's
Mhm.
sometimes it works in the relationship to just ask that and say, I can tell, you're struggling with XYZ.
Mhm.
We need to bring in so and so into the loop on this. And then, of course, that may go poorly. You may get a
Right.
no, thank you. I don't want to do that.
Right.
Um, and I think it's also, sometimes a conversation that you just have with with your administrators and say, hey, here's what I'm dealing with. I don't want to ruin the coaching relationship. I think we've got a good thing going there. We're making progress, but at the same time, I have to let you know about this so that you can do the right thing. And sometimes they're able to, to be a little bit more sly about, how they
Mhm.
became aware of it, and hopefully that can, can minimize the damage to the relationship. But
Right.
yeah, I think we've got a lot of factors to balance there. So it really
Yeah.
depends on what it is.
I mean, when we are working with humans, it can be so complex, can it? And we're building relationships and developing individuals, all for the sake of our students. And it's high stakes, no matter what role you're in. And so those tricky situations do come up. And what I think is just so valuable is at the beginning of the year, if you do have other instructional leaders on your campus, um, being able to have these conversations about what is on and off the table, how will we work in alignment of each other without necessarily weaving in and out of each other's lanes, but also making sure that nothing gets missed in the middle, right? Because I'm not in classrooms enough, or because we don't have frequent enough conversations about the goals of our teachers and where they are in their reflective capacity or whatever it might be. So yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about resistance. It's never fun to talk about. As you mentioned, we, especially when we want to take that kind of coaching stance, the hope is that it's a volunteer, not a voluntold, that they are driven and they want to be there. They are invested in the time. They're going to follow through. And when we are a coach, we might see that resistance a little bit more than if we are the administrator who is wearing the coach hat. So for those administrators who are taking that coach stance, again, they may not get as much direct feedback because they are the boss essentially in the building, but is there still resistance when our leaders act as coaches? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I guess I would divide that into direct and indirect resistance, right? Like you have the direct resistance. Like sometimes people will say, especially if you're new to a role or if you're younger. I became a principal at 27, and that might have tempted people to be a little bit more direct in their resistance now and then. You might have people say to you, "I actually don't want you in my classroom. I know you have to do formal observations. Let's set those up. We'll do one in the fall, one in the spring, and then I don't really want to see you in my classroom." If you have somebody say something like that, I think it's best to raise it directly, not confrontationally, but to say, hey, look, in order to do my job, I do need to be in classrooms more than just those formal observations.
Right.
I need to know what the needs are in our building. I need to know where our students are. I need to know where professional practice is. And that means I am going to be in classrooms. I cannot do my job if I'm not in classrooms. And I think that's a better framing than the other one that we can legitimately use, which is, I have the right to be in classrooms, and you do not have the right to tell me that I can't come in your classroom.
Right.
You may have to play that card at some point.
Right.
And I have had to play that card. And it was kind of satisfying to see the teachers union rep repeat my words to the person who was being directly resistant and saying, no, you can't come in my classroom. Saying, yeah, you can. Don't, you're not going to get away with that.
Yeah,
so, that card is there to be played if you need it. I think the indirect resistance often does look like dodging or changing the subject or not following through and saying, hey, last time we talked about this time, let's talk about something totally different. Next time, let's talk, and you don't ever have to actually change your practice if you change your focus every week. So there's that kind of jumping around to different things. I often found that certain people like to philosophize, and I personally like to talking about education philosophy. It's a lot of fun, but the problem is it doesn't get at practice, right? If it's a way out of talking about your own actual practice and what you might want to do differently, then philosophy can be a dead end. And of course, we're familiar with dead ends like, or distractions like complaining about the parents, complaining about the students, complaining about political leaders and district politics and things like that. There are lots of off-topic dodges that people use to indirectly resist talking about their practice. But when it comes to, what is this person actually thinking, we got to watch out for that philosophical one, because it sounds like we're getting at the thinking, right? We said earlier, we want to raise the level of the teacher's thinking, but we want to be careful that thinking is not divorced from their actual practice, right? And getting too philosophical can be an example of that. So I think that gets us to evidence, right? Like, what do we do about it? I think what we do about it is we anchor everything in an evidence, not, hey, what do you think? Not, what do you like Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge better? Those kind of opinion questions can go in all kinds of different unproductive directions. But if we're anchoring it in what actually happened in the lesson, what we saw, what's on the video, what's in your notes, I think that's going to be the most important thing for keeping our conversations on track.
Yeah, definitely. And you have a great metaphor that you shared on our takeaway document. Let me just share that for folks so they can see where they're going to be able to grab some great things from you after our show today. These great 10 questions, evidence-based questions for better feedback on teaching, right here for folks. But I love this. The teacher practice is like an iceberg. 10% is visible, 90% is hidden beneath the surface. And I think that's so appropriate to bring into this conversation about evidence, right? So what does that mean? Tell me more about this metaphor here, and what implications does that have for us as we give feedback?
Yeah, so I like the iceberg metaphor because it's very obvious that most of an iceberg is underwater, right? Like, everybody knows you can fly over an iceberg in an airplane, you can see it, but you're really only seeing, like, that's just a metaphor, like it's a figure of speech, right? You're seeing just the tip of the iceberg. And I think sometimes when we get into classrooms, we think we're seeing everything, right? Like, if you fly over a field, a flat field in an airplane, you can kind of see what's in that field, right? But with an iceberg, there's a lot down there, and you can land on that iceberg. I'm not an expert on iceberg exploration, but you can land on an iceberg. So you have some visible evidence that anchors your conversation, right? So you see something in the classroom, you take some notes, you record some video, you have something specific to talk about, and you use that as an entryway into talking about the rest of that iceberg. And the rest of that iceberg in our metaphor here is the decision making, the professional judgment, the teacher thinking, the planning and preparation, the background knowledge, the relationships with students, the relation, in Danielson or T-test, those domains 1 and 4 components that we know they're in our instructional framework, they're in our teacher evaluation criteria, but we can't see them directly in an observation. So the way we get at them is by asking evidence-based questions and then getting the teacher to talk and fill in, that insight about where their thinking is and what they've done that wasn't directly observable to us.
Yeah. And you have so many great, these 10 evidence-based feedback questions on feedback. These are fabulous. So these are great ones for folks to kind of put in their toolbox, write down, to plan to ask in a follow-up, to a walkthrough or an observation with a teacher that you are wanting to coach maybe, right? And work through that coaching stance with. As we think about observations, and you mentioned, some of our rubrics or frameworks that we look at for teaching, the idea of look-fors. There's this way of thinking about them that, and any observation checklist that we might have, that implies that when we come in, just as you said, it's that the flyover, we've kind of seen everything. So if we can't, as you mentioned, these questions can kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, for that role of evidence. Is there any other things that you might have in your toolbox as you think about the role of evidence in feedback conversations, especially if it's not anything that we directly saw in the classroom, or if we're looking in that observation checklist and maybe because we were only there for a short moment, we weren't able to check everything on our checklist. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that having a list of look-fors is a little bit different than having evaluation criteria, right? It's an evidence problem, right? Across the course of the school year, we do need to be able to evaluate, is this person meeting expectations in those kind of behind the scenes professional responsibilities? Are they doing planning? Are they collaborating, contacting parents and all that? We do need to find ways to substantiate that, but we should never expect that we're going to be able to see that in the classroom, right? Like, you didn't pick up the phone and call a parent during the lesson, right? That's not going to happen. And much of what we might wish we could see in a lesson is simply not going to be observable. And that speaks to both the complexity of teaching and the time constraints we face. Like 99.9% of this teacher's instruction, you are not going to see. Right? You're just not going to be there most of the year. And I think we've got to recognize that anytime that's not the case, anytime we do feel like we're seeing what we're looking for, probably somebody is playing tricks on us, right? If you walk into the classroom and teachers are doing exactly what you expected, it's probably because you clearly communicated what you wanted them to show you, and then they saw you show up and they decided, oh, I better do it, and then they did it. So we've got a real sampling problem here when it comes to look-fors. Just the reality that people can't do everything all the time. They can't use every single strategy and meet every single expectation 100% of the time. Like, sometimes you've got to pass back papers, sometimes you've got to review, sometimes kids are taking a test. There are all these different reasons that people can't show us what we want to see. And the evidence-based approach means starting with what actually happened, like what we actually observed, and saying, this might not be a super rich form of evidence. If I go in the classroom and you're passing back papers and the kids are taking a test, it's not going to be super evidence rich, but that's the reality that we've got to work with. I can't squeeze water from a rock, right? I can't get something out of that really is not there. And I think what it comes down to ultimately with a lot of our observation checklists is they're just not realistic. And if we insist on using them, sometimes what we're really insisting on is people tricking us and saying, oh, yep, I'll show you what you want to see as soon as you walk in, and then I'll go back to whatever I was doing. And probably whatever they were doing is what they needed to be doing. And if not, then that's a different conversation. So I'm just not a fan of observation checklists or look-fors. I just think we've got to start with what's actually taking place. Write it down, take some video, look at it together. I think
Right.
that's, and really no other profession adopts that kind of checklist approach either of, I want to see this when I walk in the room. It's, we start with what people are doing and talk about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever really thought of the look-fors or observation checklist as something I was expecting to see everything in one fell swoop, right? I think it was just what was observed, and take that as a snapshot. And in our virtual coaching here at Sibme, we talk about how those videos, which are often very short and focused around a particular goal, is just a snapshot. It's a snapshot from just that particular week, and just kind of that underlying connotation that we aren't taking this, for more than it is. It's just a grain of salt, right? And it's not the whole thing. So yeah, you've got me thinking now a little bit around those look-fors and observations checklists that we see so commonly in all of our schools, for sure. So,
and that's not to say that we should never have,
right,
a certain feel or a certain tone, right? And sometimes those are the majority of the things on the checklist. Does it feel positive? Are students engaged? Like, it's not an unreasonable look for to want students to be engaged in some way, right? But it's just, when we get more specific, sometimes we start to expect things that are unrealistic to see in a 10-minute walkthrough.
Right, as you're just kind of popping from classroom to classroom. Absolutely. So I've really enjoyed this conversation and talking about the coaching stance from more of that administrator view, and the different roles that our administrators wear. We know our coaches who have that role of coach or specialist or whatever that particular title is, wear many hats. We talk about that a lot, but we don't always talk here on the Coach Replay Show about our campus and district administrators. So this has been really great. I want to wrap us up with just a comment that Kim had posted earlier in the show, just how tricky it is when coaches are administrators, and shifting between can be tricky to navigate. Do you have any tips for our folks who, either for lack of instructional coaches or for wanting to take that coaching stance from time to time, any tips for them on how to navigate that shift with their people?
Yeah, well, thank you, Corey, and thank you, Kim. That's a great question and an important tension. I like what Dr. Tanya Gori says, and I know she's been a guest of yours in the past. And she says in my schools, everybody has a coach, but your coach is not your evaluator. So I think if you have multiple administrators, that's a great way to do it, and just formally separate those roles. So you might have 0 instructional coaches and 2 administrators, and say, okay, the teachers you evaluate and the teachers you coach are going to be 2 separate groups of people. So I think that's one way to do it. I think the other way to do it is to simply keep the stakes as low as possible, as much of the time as possible, right? So if you're doing a walkthrough or a coaching cycle, you don't want to go all the way and say this is non-evaluative, because frankly, things that happen are fair game as evidence in the evaluation typically. You don't want to promise that it's non-evaluative, but you want to increase the sense of safety and lower the stakes as much as possible. One way to do that is to just do it more often, right? If it's not our one shot for the year, then the stakes get lower. If it's our one shot, very high stakes, then people are going to be stressed. It's going to be more tense. And then when it comes to that, that conversation itself, if you can remain in the coach role, wear that coach hat and not have to put the boss hat on, you're going to be in great shape, right? If you have to also put the leader hat on and say, oh yeah, you need books, I'll order you some books. Well, that's not going to threaten the coaching relationship. You can wear the leader hat alongside the coach hat or the boss hat. It's just the boss hat and the coach hat don't go together.
Right. There's some friction there. Yeah.
And I think sometimes we've just got to make a choice and say, you know what, I'm going to torpedo the coaching value of this conversation because my boss role is more important here. I really need to deal with this issue. So don't be afraid to do that if you have to. Just know it is a choice. Sometimes you do have to choose between them. You cannot, both hold people's feet to the fire and create a sense of safety in the same moment. Like sometimes you just got to do that and pick between them.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Psychological safety even talks a lot about how, it's not about psychological safety is not does not flourish in a place where everybody is comfortable where they are. It does not flourish in a place where there is low accountability. It actually is best in places where there's high accountability and where people feel, you know, fulfilled and driven and okay to take risks and kind of go outside of that box. They're in that learning zone as well. So it made me think of that when you said that. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure getting to talk with you. And folks, if you have not already downloaded or signed up in the email to receive the notes and takeaways in your inbox directly today, be sure to access them in our Learning Center. Download it. You'll also find ways to be able to follow Justin, so that way you can find out more about the Principal Center, access more great resources like these 10 questions, evidence-based questions for feedback. Follow him on Facebook and Twitter as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Corey, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure and great to speak with you.
Yeah, I want to remind folks as we get closer to the end of the month, we have a great episode next week. It's a replay on that phenomena Divulsion, dark evil vortex of late September, October, November. It is setting in, y'all. So be thinking about that. That's coming up. We also have a whole lineup of shows for next month of October. It's almost here. It's almost fall, y'all. And we are focusing on our mental health and wellness. So tune in for all of those shows. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to Sibme and the Coach Replay Show so you never miss another one. Thanks so much. See y'all next week.